to the McElhaney Report. I'm Bill McElhaney. On this show, we cover current topics of the day, but always from a perspective or viewpoint rarely aired by the mass media. We hope you find it interesting. Since 1989, the world has been told that the Soviet Union collapsed and that, except for a few countries, communism is dead and the U.S. won the Cold War. The truth, the reality, is quite the reverse. Everything we have seen since 1989 has been a massive and successful, multi-decade-long deception strategy on the part of the KGB, the Soviet secret police. The goal? To deceive the West and achieve the goal of Leninist strategy, a totalitarian world government or international police state. We know this from the evidence provided by Anatoly Golitsyn, the most important defector from the KGB who came to America in 1961. In 1980, he wrote a book, New Lies for Old, which was published in 1984. This described the disinformation strategy and made specific predictions as to what the KGB would be doing in subsequent years, such as removing the Berlin Wall, changing the name of the KGB and other state structures, and the role to be played by Mikhail Gorbachev. An independent analysis showed that 94% of the predictions made in that book in 1980 came true by 1991 and since that time. And that's how we know Golitsyn was telling the truth and quite correct. And understanding Golitsyn is absolutely indispensable to an understanding of international terrorism today, what happened on September 11th, and the war recently fought in Iraq. Our guest today, who first appeared on this show in 1995, is uniquely qualified to expose this conspiratorial strategy. Based in London, he publishes 10 newsletters and reviews on economic, financial, and political intelligence, including Soviet Analyst. These invaluable periodicals incorporate the understanding of post-1989 events provided by Golitsyn. He has published Golitsyn's second book, Perestroika-Täuschung. He's also published Joseph Douglas's Red Cocaine on the Soviet strategy of using drug trafficking as a means of sabotaging the West, and a very important book, the European Union Collective on the regional world government now in place over both Europe and Britain. I am so happy to welcome back to the McElhaney Report my good friend and colleague, Christopher Story.
Delighted to be here.
In the introduction, I tried to summarize briefly what we've covered in prior shows. And what I want to concentrate on today is another major example of Soviet strategy since 1961, or what was called the Third Party Program from 1961 onward. And the fact that this strategy has continued unbroken since 1989 is just another example of the continuity of KGB control in the Soviet Union and the other communist countries, despite the pretense and deception about reform and democratism and changes that allegedly were made. And that, of course, is the International Terror Network. Now, we had the benefit of knowing, going back to the early 1980s, from works like Claire Sterling's very important study, The Terror Network, we had the ability of knowing that by the early 1960s, the Soviet KGB literally created an international terror network worldwide in scope, with training centers around the world in Soviet satellite nations, and headed by two principal directorates. The one directorate of this being the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, Leadership Directorate, comprised of several parts, and headed by Moscow-trained Yasser Arafat. And also the Cuban-based, the KGB in Cuba is the DRG, the Cuban-based tricontinental apparatus. And these were the two directorates running this terror network created by the Soviets in the mid-60s. So let's talk about that terror network, because it still exists today. And we're told communism has collapsed, and yet their terror network is functioning more actively with the same KGB control today.
Yes. In, I think it was January 1966, the Soviets summoned a special conference in Cuba called the Tricontinental Conference. And as far as I recall, 538 delegations from communist structures around the world arrived at this conference. And this conference decided and agreed, in accordance with a Soviet plan, to establish a network of terror training camps. And they started doing this in Cuba, and by October 1966, a whole series of terrorism training camps had sprung up on the outskirts of Havana. And these terror training camps and operations were controlled by a KGB colonel called Colonel Vadim Kochagin. And by the end of the first year of operations, 1967, they were turning out 1,500 trained terrorists for operations all over the world in their own countries and elsewhere. Now, in not very long afterwards, these Cuban-trained terrorists, who included Arabs and Palestinians, were setting up what I call the second generation of terror training operations in various parts of the Middle East, Lebanon being the most important. Now, the Iranians are very important in this. The Iranians control Hezbollah, as you know, which is an absolutely deadly terrorism operation, a terrorism network.
And that occurred after the Carter administration betrayed our ally, the Shah of Iran, and helped the Communist Two-Day Party in Iran install the current dictatorship.
That's right, and once the current dictatorship had been installed, the Two-Day Party was largely eliminated, which is standard practice. Very often, for reasons which are too complex to explain, for example, in an interview,
briefly,
these people are eliminated when their sell-by date has been passed. So terrorism, by the way, terrorism, of course, is integral with the revolution. I mean, Lenin was a terrorist, Trotsky is a terrorist, the Chekar, the predecessor of the KGB, the founder of the KGB was one of the most evil men ever to have lived, called Felix Dzerzhinsky.
Yes.
And you might be interested in the following interesting fact. Guess what Felix Dzerzhinsky's birthday is? 11th of September. An interesting pointer.
Yeah, interesting point. Well, then let's talk about, since we know the KGB established this terror network in the mid-'60s, had two regional directorates for it, the PLO apparatus and the Tricontinental apparatus. What do we know today about its continuity, the connection it would have to individuals like Osama bin Laden and to Al-Qaeda?
Right, well, if I could just step back, because I think we've got a slight... people like us, analysts, we have to put together information which is not necessarily current, although we try to live with current, but it's very rare to obtain absolute, current information. We know that the KGB because of Vadim Kochagin, we know that the Cuban camp operation was a KGB operation, and we know also that the establishment of training areas in the Middle East was KGB. But we also know from a source which I found, which is a book by a man called Gail Rivers, who was a New Zealand terror expert and an intelligence officer. He writes in a very interesting book called The War Against Terrorists, How to Win It, dated 1986. And I just want to read you this because this is of extraordinary importance.